Well, have you heard the claim from Christians that the apostles died for their beliefs, therefore Christianity is true? Well, this is the claim that Armin Navabi responds to in chapter 16 of his book, Why There Is No God, Simple Responses to 20 Common Arguments for the Existence of God. Let me just say, when I started this book on January 9, and I knew obviously it's 20 arguments, so it would take me 20 weeks, but I was not expecting by taking weeks off and filling in other weeks with different topics and kind of mixing things up, that this book actually would go on to last pretty much the whole entire year. And so here we are. It's November. This is part 16, and we just have this one and 4 more parts left to go after this. And so it's been fun. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. And again, as always, it kind of gets us talking about things that are slightly different, and then allowing you to call in and ask your questions. So this is what we're going to be talking about this week, chapter 16, where he addresses the comment, so many people died for religion or God, so surely it must be real. And that is what we're going to be talking about. Now, before we jump into today's topic, let me just say this, is next week, I am not going to be here on Tuesday. I actually fly out on Thursday for West Virginia. I'm speaking at a conference all weekend in West Virginia, and I don't even come back into home until Tuesday night. So what I've decided to do is I'm pushing back next week's live stream to Thursday. And because there always are calls and questions, which I think are really fun, I'm just going to make next week a call-in show. And so, hey, today, November 5th, is going to be chapter 16 from this book on martyrs and how is that used as evidence for or against the truth of Christianity or other religions. November 14 is going to be the open, just Q&A live show. So bring your questions, mark that down on your calendars if you want to call in and have a conversation with me. Then we'll be back to Tuesdays on November 19. And that is going to be chapter 17 of this book on, does the violence of secularists, of atheists, when atheists are violent, does that leave or provide evidence against atheism, is what Armin's going to respond to in chapter 17. And then finally, what I'm looking forward to as well is the last show of November 26th, is on the scientific evidence for human origins, namely Adam and Eve. And so is there a way in which we can give a testable scientific creation model that matches up with Genesis? And so Dr. Fuzz Rana is going to come on and chat with me about that. He wrote the book, Who Was Adam? And so that's going to be a fun conversation. So anyways, those are the shows coming up. You might have seen that I posted on the community tab on my YouTube channel and on Instagram, kind of what shows are coming up this month and which topics are you interested in. And so you can always be on the lookout for what's coming up. And then exciting, hopefully December, finishing up this book, addressing the last 3 chapters and finishing up the year. So it's been fun. And yeah, so, and by the way, all the shows are happening at 1:30 p.m. Pacific time. Generally on Tuesdays is what I shoot for. So anyways, my name is Ryan Pauly. This is the show Think Well, the show that is designed to train you to think well about the Christian faith and about culture and about objections to the Christian faith so that you can engage in these conversations better. And I think this is going to be part of the conversation today, is what we're kind of looking at is how do we have better conversations around the evidence for the truth of Christianity when we're having these sort of conversations between Christians and atheists or Christians and really any other group. And so that's what we're going to talk about. I say this often, but I don't think that there's a ton to talk about today. I have a few things on my mind based on this chapter. And so, yeah, if you want to kind of line up with questions in the live chat, please place a Q before those just so I can filter through the live chat quickly and find your questions, or you can use the link that I posted there in the live chat to call into the show. So Travis, good to see you here as always. All right, so Armin Navabi starts this chapter, and I just want to say this has happened a few times throughout this book where I got done reading this chapter and I was really disappointed. I just felt like he didn't actually address the argument or what people are claiming, and almost in a sense of taking the weakest form of it. And you'll kind of see this as I talk about it here in a little bit, but I was really kind of like bummed out thinking like, oh, okay, he needs to address kind of the strongest argument, at least from a Christian side. He can address other religions as well to actually show how this is not good evidence or arguments. And I feel like he kind of missed the mark in this chapter at really providing a case against the best argument from the other side. Instead, it was almost like a bad argument, which I would agree with his conclusions here in the chapter. I would agree with what he said. I just don't think he addressed kind of the strongest argument. So I'm going to kind of walk through his objections and then present what I think is a better argument based on the lives of martyrs and people who have given their life for their beliefs. So he starts off and he says in the very first sentence, the study of world religions yields a bloody history. Holy wars have been fought between different factions of believers. Martyrs have willingly given up their lives for the religious beliefs. People have been sacrificed to appease angry gods, and victims have been tortured and killed in the name of religion. This history, though, he says more about the violent and hurtful aspects of human nature than it does about the existence of God. I think it is important to recognize what he addresses here, and even some things that he says throughout this chapter, is he says, whether it's religious or non-religious, this is what humans do. And I would say, yeah, you're right. This is what humans do. It is not specifically to certain religions, although some religions have more of it. Humans have often done some pretty terrible things. And when I took my class, Why God Allows Evil, we walked through some absolute evil, horrific, tragic actions taken throughout human history. And our professor would always say, is this inhuman? Is this crazy? He goes, no, this is what humans do. This is what humans do. Humans commit genocide. Humans commit murder. Humans do terrible things. Now, one kind of side point that I thought was interesting when you look at this is there's like an encyclopedia of war that documents every war that is kind of documented that we know about and is in writing. And there's something like 1,700 of these wars in the known human history that have been documented in this encyclopedia of war. And in this encyclopedia, in the section on which wars are religious in nature, it attributes only about 6.7% of all wars are religious in nature. And with that, Islam counts for about half. And so when you look at all the other religions in the world, minus Islam, it's about 3% of all wars in general. So again, wars are bad. These things are terrible. These things should not happen. But we recognize it's not simply religious people doing this. Even if you count all religions, 6%, that means 94% of wars are for non-religious people or for non-religious reasons. And that is what we fight each other. This is not something good, but this is what we do. And so he moves on from that and talking about, look, yeah, we are violent and we do bad things to each other and we do bad things to ourselves. And that is an issue here. He then goes on to this idea that, look, people will die for what they believe in. This is the next section of his chapter, is people will die for what they believe in. And again, this is true. We've seen this in many different religions and even non-religious things. And that's what he addresses here at the very beginning. He says this: people have frequently been willing to risk their lives for political, religious, or cultural reasons through actions like hunger strikes, self-immolation, violent protests, and more. And he says, why would people do this? Why would anyone choose to die or welcome death for these reasons? And he says, because many of these worldviews rely on belief systems that promote self-sacrifice as a method transcending death or a way to find greater purpose. Right? And there's a lot of truth to this, that we have this desire to be transcendent. We have this desire to reach beyond where we are and to have this deeper meaning in life. And some people turn to taking their own life or taking the lives of others, or these certain actions where they're willing to die or put their life on the line for their beliefs. This is true. This is almost kind of what we talked about a little bit last week, where we talked about the absurdity of life without God, where many people commented on my show with very different beliefs. Christians and atheists are like, yeah, that's true. If there is no God, there is no objective meaning. There is no objective purpose, and all we have is what we make of it, our own personal preferences. And while I may have something that's personally meaningful to me, that ultimately is meaningless still. And so how do we then live a purposeful life? And some people turn to try to find something transcendent. Now, I did an interview on this topic a while back. My professor at Pauly University, Dr. Clay Jones, wrote this book, Immortal: How the Fear of Death Drives Us and What We Can Do About It. And this is exactly what he addresses here in this book. And so I've put this in the description below on YouTube. You can find a link to the book as well as a link to my interview with him on the topic. But what he addresses here is what Armin talks about in this chapter. is that people are willing to die because they're trying to transcend death. They're trying to get past just this basic, simple life that we have. Armin writes this: one theory offers an explanation for this common practice of assigning a greater meaning or notion of non-performance to death. Terror management theory. Essentially, he writes, the theory states that because humans are uniquely aware of their mortality, they create coping mechanisms to overcome the anxiety associated with it, right? And in this book, Immortal, Dr. Jones lays this out and what he calls immortality projects. And he addresses that we have this fear of death, and often we want to deny the fear of death, or sometimes the fear of death is actually driving us to do something. And so he talks about what he calls a literal immortality project, where people are literally trying to use healthy living and use science and transhumanism to literally make themselves immortal. And I wrote about this in my recent chapter for a book I wrote on the theology of technology, where I looked at books from like Yuval Harari, historian who talks about like this idea. He wrote this book, Homo Deus, that Homo sapiens will become Homo Deus, that we will become gods, and that we will reach immortal, because in his view, every problem is a physical problem. Every problem is a technical problem. Therefore, with enough technology, we will be able to find the solution to every problem, including the solution to human death. And so this would be his project that he's on, trying to say, I'm going to solve death by getting more technology and solving these technical problems that we have. And so there's transhumanism and cryonics and all these sort of things where people are literally trying to achieve immortality because the anxiety and fear of their own mortality is driving them to try to cope with this and find a solution. Dr. Jones then lays out what he calls symbolic immortality projects, where we have through procreation, I'm going to live on through my family name. And so because my family will go on, that is how I will be remembered. Or maybe it's through ancestor worship, or maybe it's through activism and making a difference. And I'm going to become some celebrity, and my name is going to be plastered on some sort of building where it will be the Ryan Pauly Library. And now everyone will know and care about who I am. The issue is, how many buildings with names on them do we honestly stop and wonder who are the people? And there's often like the plaque in the front that's like, here are the people and why we named the building after them. But many of us don't care. Many of us don't care about who our, or even many of us don't even know who our great grandparents are. Back in July, I was in Salt Lake City, Utah. I'm traveling around downtown Salt Lake, seeing all the different LDS sites. And right there next to the museum is the Genealogy Research Center. And I walked in there and I got on a computer system and I looked up my family name, and I was able to trace it back to like my great grandpa or something like that. It was like 3 or 4 generations past my grandma, who was the oldest that I knew at that time. Now I've forgotten his name already. I have pictures on my phone, but really, like, do we honestly care? And is that actually providing some sort of symbolic immortality? So we want to be, have fans. We want to do this sort of thing. We want this spotlight. And this is how we have this symbolic immortality he talks about in this chapter. He then talks about how some people just want to mitigate these immortality projects, that we go, oh no, living forever would be boring. You don't actually want to live forever. Or death is just a necessary part of life. It just goes on, and that's just what we got to deal with. Or, hey, we're just lucky we're born. Death is nothing. Don't worry about it. And so we just live in the present, just live in the moment and don't worry about it. Don't think about the end. And so it's just trying to mitigate or to ignore what is actually going to happen. And so I think this book was an interesting read, as well as the conversation I had with Dr. Jones on YouTube, that addressed exactly what Armin is talking about here. That there are some people who are willing to die for what they believe in, trying to cope with the fact that they are uniquely aware of their mortality. And this creates anxiety and issues, and so we try to deal with it. And so the question is, are these ways of dealing with it actually working? Is it actually doing something? And Dr. Jones talks about all of the different failed approaches to immortality. From denial to addictions, to just saying everything is meaningless, to just depression, to drugs, to suicide, anarchy, all these sort of things that we kind of turn to that actually doesn't solve the problem that we have. And so Armin goes into this a little bit deeper. And then he talks about these suicide cults, where he talks about Heaven's Gate in 1997, where 39 people died believing that they would board some UFO, or in the 1970s, where we have Jim Jones, who pronounced himself to be the Messiah and led more than 900 people to kill themselves. Belief that dying and participation in these cults was going to provide meaning or transcendence for these individuals. Armin then takes these examples and says, but we don't believe that the fact that these people killed themselves believing they would go to UFO, that this means that their founders were true or that their beliefs were true. We recognize this is what people do. And Armin actually goes on at the end and says it's tragic, and it is. It's horrible that some people are so deceived or led astray that they are willing to just kill themselves for a hope of something transcendent, for a hope of something that is immortal. And he goes, look, and it's also not unique to certain religions. He goes, martyrs come from Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, other religious backgrounds. And not all of them can be right. So when you have a Muslim martyr and you have a Christian martyr, well, clearly Islam and Christianity contradict each other, so they can't both be right. And so that's the issue. He then ends by saying there's no evidence of an afterlife. We should recognize the true value of our current lives as our one and only shot at happiness. Wasting it on an unfounded claim in ancient myths is an absolute tragedy. And that's where Armin kind of leaves this chapter. Now, much of this I agree with. And that's what was a little bit disappointing in the fact that I felt like he didn't really address the deep, deep issues, or not necessarily the deep issues. He didn't address the better arguments that are often out there. And that's where Clay Jones ends his book, is saying, yes, there's a lot of people that tragically have taken their lives in hope for immortality. Or there are a lot of people who are led astray, being promised something good in hopes to transcend the issues that they have. However, the issue is these don't work. But there is an actual true hope. And that would be the hope that is actually found in trusting in Jesus Christ and in Christianity. And Dr. Jones goes into the evidence for the resurrection with the primary sources, the fact that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion, that he was buried, his tomb was found empty, that the disciples proclaimed that Jesus had risen from the dead, and they were willing to suffer and die for this belief, that this actually leads to evidence of the truth of Christianity that does provide true immortality. This is what we read about in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now notice, it's not just because that these sort of things failed, therefore Christianity is true. And even like last week, I had people comment like, well, just because life is absurd without God doesn't mean that God does exist. And I said, you're right. I never concluded last week, therefore God does exist. The point was simply to think through two alternative perspectives. There is a world with God and a world without God. And in the world without God, there is no ultimate meaning, purpose, or values or morality. In a world with God, you do have those things. Now, that doesn't mean God does exist. You'd have to make an argument for objective values and purpose and meaning to then conclude, therefore, there is a God, but it's to get you to consider these two different options. Same thing is true here. Christianity actually does offer true immortality, true everlasting life. And so that is why I think these sort of conversations matter so much, is that we have to consider the evidence for the truth of Christianity. And we have to look at, is there good reason to believe it? And what I was disappointed with in Armin's chapter is it was like, look, here are some suicide cults. This is not unique to any one religion. Therefore, there's no reason to believe it. And I think that there's something unique that he left off. Now, how I started the show is that I asked the question, have you ever heard about the fact that the apostles, the disciples of Jesus, had died for their beliefs, therefore Christianity is true? And there's something unique about how that is presented than how Armin started his chapter, where he just said, people have died for God or religion, therefore it must be true. And so I want to agree with Armin and says, yes, just because someone dies believing something, that provides no evidence whatsoever of the truth of what they believed in. Just like if I died today, you would not say, well, the fact that Ryan died, or whenever I die, the fact that Ryan died means Christianity is true. No, my death is meaningless when it comes to whether Christianity is true or not. The difference of what we have in the apostles is that they were actually eyewitnesses. Now, Sean McDowell goes into this a little bit. He wrote the book for his doctoral dissertation on the fate of the apostles. And I linked to a video below on YouTube as well that goes into what was unique, or at least different, right? You may not agree that theirs is true, but at least what was different about an argument for Christianity based on the fate of the apostles and what happened to them versus martyrs like Jim Jones and Muslim martyrs today. And the important distinction is that modern martyrs today were not eyewitnesses. They were not there at the beginning when these things supposedly took place. The apostles of Jesus were. The first important point to recognize about the argument from the death of the fate of the apostles and their deaths were the fact that they were actually apostles. And what does it mean to be an apostle? Well, Acts chapter 1, verses 21 and 22 lays this out and gives two criteria. When the apostles are choosing a new apostle, in Acts chapter 1, there were two criteria that they looked at. Number one is that the person had to be with Jesus since his baptism. It says we have to find someone who's been with us since the beginning when John baptized Jesus and was with us all the way through to when Jesus rose from the dead. And so this was part of the criteria, is you had to have been with Jesus, seen Jesus, experienced Jesus, been there when he died, and seen him risen from the dead. And so this is something that is very different about martyrs today. Now, again, you may not think they saw Jesus rise from the dead, but it's very different to say this person was actually there and died for their belief versus this person wasn't there and died for something they were told was true. You have to at least recognize that difference. Again, it doesn't mean the apostles were right. This doesn't prove Christianity is true. I sometimes feel like I just have to say it. This is not proof of Christianity, but it does show the sincerity of the apostles. And that sincerity is different than martyrs today because they were actually there. Right? And just think about it. If a student said, this is what happened in Mr. Pauly's classroom, or one of you said, this is what happened during Ryan's live stream, and then you actually are kind of suffering for that. Someone goes, that's not true. And you put your life in the line. I don't know why you would do that. It's crazy. But anyways, if that were to happen, that's very different than if you told someone what happened during my live stream and then that person was suffering. It's like, well, they never saw it. They weren't there. They only are hearing it secondhand or third hand or fourth hand or down the line. What we recognize about the apostles is that one is just different. Number two, we recognize that this is the earliest message of Christianity from the very beginning is they were preaching the risen Jesus. Turn to Acts chapter 2. Jesus is risen from the dead and Peter goes out after Pentecost. It's like, this is Jesus who you crucified. He is risen. And so this is an early message. This isn't a late addition. This isn't a late thing. Again, we read in 1 Corinthians 15 it lays out all of the things that took place. For he was killed by Roman crucifixion, he was buried, and he raised, and he appeared to these people. And you have even skeptical scholars like Bart Ehrman and Gerd Ludman who said that this creed found in the beginning of 1 Corinthians 15 that lays out Jesus' death, his burial, and his appearances, that they would say that this comes from within 5 years of the event itself. This doesn't have time to be this late legend. We're saying from the earliest messages preached by the Christians in the first century, they were preaching a crucified, buried, and risen Jesus. This is not a late thing. This is not a late legend. This was happening from the beginning. Number three, we recognize, as Sean lays out, that this preaching was in opposition to the Roman state. They preached that to say Jesus is God is in a sense saying that Caesar is not God. And so they're also not just going along with the culture and everything is working out nice for them. This is what you're supposed to say. It's like, no, they preach something contrary to what was expected of them and contrary to the state, which will cause them to be thrown in prison, to be beaten, and to be persecuted. And we recognize as well that the disciples would not stop preaching even when threatened, beaten, and persecuted. And we have historical evidence that some of them, not necessarily all, but some of them actually died for their faith. And we have no documented evidence of an apostle ever recanting. So what we have here is an important distinction that, again, this is not proof of Christianity. But when the multiple eyewitnesses say they saw something and experienced something, and are willing to suffer and even die for that testimony, it is a strong evidence that they're not just making it up. The people generally don't just make stuff up and lie about it and then go to death for that lie. Right? J. Warner Wallace talks a lot about conspiracy theories in his work as a LAPD homicide detective. And we see TV shows about this too, but I think there's truth to it, as he says as well, is like conspiracy theories are best when there's a group of individuals that do something and then you kill off all your liability and then it's only held with one person. Because the more people alive, the more chance that someone is going to break, or the more chance that someone's going to get drunk at some party and say, hey, guess what? It actually is all a lie. Right? You don't want more people. We don't have that with any of the disciples. No one ever recanting, no one ever saying, hey, by the way, we just made this up. Again, there's a difference with that than what we saw in modern day apostles and these kind of death cults that Armin talks about in his book, where these people are being led astray and they're dying for something they believe is true, but they weren't eyewitnesses. They weren't there, and they're dying for what they were told, versus the apostles were dying for what they actually saw and experienced. Right? There's a difference there. And again, what I think is interesting, if you go, well, that's not possible because there is no supernatural, miracles are not possible. Like, I would challenge you to kind of think through, what is it that would get you to believe in the reality of a miracle? Right? And the question I often ask with this is like, look, think about the apostles, for example. If you saw someone alive, you experienced them, you lived with them, you ate with them, you talked with them, they were alive. And then you watched them die. You watched a spear go into their side and pierce their heart and their lung. You saw them be buried in the ground. You were at their funeral. You actually saw and experienced them dead. You knew they were dead. And then a few days later, you actually see them alive again physically. Would that convince you that something took place? And if that's actually what happened, and if we have good historical evidence for it, would that not be evidence for a miracle? Because there is no natural explanation for it. Dead bodies stay dead. And so if Jesus really was alive at point A, dead at point B, and alive at point C, then we have evidence, historical evidence for an actual miracle. And so that would then explain the disciples' sincere belief and proclamation that Jesus had been risen from the dead, and their willingness to even take this to the grave. So at least, while this isn't evidence for Christianity necessarily in the sense that this isn't proof that Christianity is true, I think that we at least recognize, or should recognize, that this is different than martyrs today. This is what I was hoping to see Armin kind of discuss as he responded to this argument. The fact that it wasn't brought up in his chapter, I was a little bit disappointed. And so it's like, yeah, I agree with you. Just because someone dies for their belief doesn't mean it's true. People die for their beliefs all the time. Doesn't mean that's true. If I died for my belief, that is no way proof that Christianity is true. But what we have with the apostles is at least different. Now, you may disagree that actually took place, but at least we have to recognize there's a difference there. So with that, I think I'm pretty much done. And so with this chapter, I thought hopefully that was interesting. If you have calls, please call in. I'm going to start walking through this live chat here, looking for questions. But again, if you want to call in and chat with me, please click on that link and do so. We got a good amount of time left in the show. All right. So Travis, as always here, appreciate it. And Travis asks this: why would focusing on one religion out of 4,200 matter when martyrs happen to many false beliefs and doesn't increase the chance of anything being true? Right. So I think this question came in at the very beginning. So Travis, I don't know if I answered that question for you, why I think there is something different about the Christian religion having experienced it. Martyrs that die in Islam today, we're not there with Muhammad at the beginning, seeing and experiencing those things. And there wasn't this sort of a miracle with Muhammad, like you have with the evidence, or at least with the claims of Jesus dying and rising from the dead with Christianity. So there is a difference here about the Christian claim than anybody else. And so I think we have to take claims, each claim on its own merit, so to speak. Just because one person lies or many people lie doesn't mean everybody is lying. And so we have to recognize that, while there's 4,200, as you say, religions out there that maybe have false martyrs, it doesn't mean that every religion has a false martyr if you can show that there's something different, which is what I've tried to do here. Oh, interesting question. All right, Travis asked this: are we violent because we're made in God's image? Well, no. we're not. But I think that what I initially read when I read this was, how are we violent if we're made in God's image? And I think what's interesting here is we have to recognize, again, the Christian story, that God created us in his image, that we are relational, thoughtful, spiritual beings, but yet we are fallen. Yet even in our fallen state, we still retain the image of God in us. It is not destroyed. And we see this after the flood in Genesis chapter 9, where God says, you should not commit murder because you are made in the image of God. And so we recognize this image that is still in us, which is the very thing that allows us to criticize those who commit murder, to punish those who've done wrong because they've actually done something wrong. And I think this is why you have this interesting cultural discussion, if you want to call it that, of if the humans are not made in God's image, how do you argue for human equality? There's a lot of conversations where in order to say that men and women are equal, you have to say that we're the same, because any difference also means not same. And if there's a difference, then that means one is better and one is worse, and therefore they don't have human equality. But when we look around ourselves, everyone is different. Everyone is a different culture and size and ethnicity and gender and height and strength and different talents and abilities. Like, we are all different. In what sense are we equal? In what sense do we have equal value, no matter how small or big, young or old we are? So I think it's actually the image of God, not what makes us violent. It's our broken, sinful, fallen natures is why we are violent, because God is not violent in that sense. God is not out there doing these wicked things. God is angry at injustice and evil, so as we should be. And just like a good judge is not violent when he punishes a guilty criminal to go to jail, God is not being violent when he punishes wicked people for the sins that they've committed. So we're not violent because we're made in the image of God. It's our brokenness that leads to our violence, but it's the image of God that it leads, grounds human dignity, equality, and human worth, to where when someone violates someone else, we can actually say that is objectively wrong. I don't understand that question from you, Travis. Are there any problems that are non-physical in nature? What are they? I don't know what problems you're kind of speaking of there. Again, if you got questions, it doesn't matter that they're eyewitnesses. Why not? Why is it not an important distinction, Travis, that the disciples were not eyewitnesses? Again, if you want to call in, Travis, I'd love to chat. You're posting a ton here, which is great. But if you want to call in, I would love to chat with you as well. Let's see, what else do we have here? Okay, not a question, but Jesse says the Gospels are written anonymously. Mark wasn't an eyewitness, so it's hearsay at best. Mark, Matthew, and Luke are copied. Big part of Mark. The fate of most of the apostles is unknown. Only Paul and Peter and James are known. You're right. So I would agree with you on the last part. The fate of most of the apostles is unknown, but we do have Paul, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and James, the brother of John, that we have documentation of their martyrdom. And so we at least have 4 documentations of martyrdom of the apostles. We also know that we don't have any documentation of others recanting. The issue of the Gospels written anonymously. I did a YouTube show a while back with Bill Mounts on Bible difficulties and translation difficulties. And I addressed this question with him, are the Gospels written anonymously? And that's true in the sense that they didn't say, I, Mark, pen this document, or I, Luke, pen this document. The issue, but what is true though, is that they're not anonymous. In the same way, if I write a letter and I don't sign my name on it, but from the very beginning, everyone recognizes that that was my letter and knows that that is my letter, and it's passed on orally that was my letter, then it's not anonymous in that sense. And so we have, and Bill Mounts talked about in that interview, that every single New Testament manuscript, even the early manuscripts, have the name on the document. It's not in it, but at least have the name on it. And the church unanimously recognized that these documents were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Luke talks about interviewing eyewitnesses. This is how the book of Luke begins. Mark is believed to be the companion of Peter. And so Peter was the eyewitness telling Luke what to write down. And so he's writing down the eyewitness testimony of Peter. And so we do have at least eyewitness claims in the Gospels themselves. Would I leave, Travis asks, would I leave Christianity and join another cult if it had people that died who said they were eyewitnesses to miracles? No, Travis, I wouldn't. I don't care about an eyewitness to a miracle. What is important here with the apostles is they were eyewitnesses to the miracle. The cross, the death, the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the key distinction of Christianity. Everything hinges on this. This is what Christianity rises or falls on. And Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. If the dead are not raised, if Jesus was not been raised, then your faith is in vain. You should be pitied. You are wasting your time. You're lying about God if Jesus was not raised. But if Jesus is raised from the dead, then Christianity is true. Everything hinges on the death and resurrection of Jesus. So it is not just an eyewitness to a miracle, something secondary, something just off over here that is meaningless in a sense. It is an eyewitness to the key distinction that sets Christianity apart from everything else. And so no, just because there's some random miracle, I believe that supernatural things happen. I believe that demonic things happen and can look like miracles. You read the Bible, right? In Exodus, Moses does miracles, and so did the Egyptian, magicians of Egypt, right? They did supernatural things. And so just because something supernatural takes place, I'm not going to go chasing that down, right? What we're talking about here is a core key distinction of Christianity that is claimed to have been seen, experienced by eyewitnesses, in which there is also historical documentation of. All right, question here by Fuzzy Jeff Theory. If there were no identifiable eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus, would that make you reconsider Christianity? Look, I would definitely reconsider, I think, the case for the strength of Christianity. We have to recognize that is one piece of the puzzle for sure. At the same time, if you talk to homicide detectives, right? If we're talking about the homicide of Jesus, the death of Jesus, there are times, and I've, again, talked to J. Warner Wallace about this, and I've interviewed him on my show about this, where there are times in which he has gone back and been able to solve homicides when no living eyewitnesses are still left to talk to. But you have evidence left behind, documentation left behind that they are able to piece together and make a case and convict someone of murder. And so while eyewitnesses don't prove something to be true, people could be lying or mistaken, the lack of eyewitnesses also doesn't prove it didn't happen. But I think they are a strong piece that leads to the credibility of the truth of Christianity. I think that it would be really tough. I think it'd be hard to believe it if there's no eyewitness testimony at all. Like if nothing, like that, I mean, that means now the Gospels never even really existed, or maybe the beginning of the Gospels did, and we learn about Jesus, but no one actually saw him risen from the dead. The question is, okay, what else took place? Who is documenting this? What happened? And that may be something that we can't know. So I would definitely, I don't know. I think on the surface, and thinking this, I think that would be problematic, but that would not automatically mean it to be false. So it definitely had to be taken into consideration. All right. So Travis, you say point C. So Jesus is alive at point A, dead at point B, and alive again at point C. You say point C is a myth. How'd you come to that conclusion? What evidence do you have that point C is a myth, or how do you respond to all of the positive evidence for it? How would you object to all of the positive evidence for point C? All right, next question here comes in. Amobu, if you don't believe that three little pigs built houses, then how do you explain that I'm trying to figure out the last part of your sentence here. If you don't believe that three little pigs built little houses, then how do you explain that they would blow two of them away? Look, I'm not sure how to say this exactly. But if we are just going to assume that all of this is mythological, like the story of the three little pigs, and just go, that's what you have, end of story. I just want to challenge you. So I don't think you're taking this seriously. If I can say that, I don't think you're taking it seriously, right? It's like saying, hey, here's what I have. I have a case that I'm presenting in court for the conviction of this said criminal. And you go, well, over here in X movie that's clearly made up, or Three Little Pigs and that didn't happen, so neither did this. It's like, well, that's not even comparable. This is a false analogy. It's a weak analogy. You have to show how these are analogous, and to just simply claim, well, what you believe is a myth too, end of story. You're not considering the fact that there is a different level of evidence for it. Now, again, and I had to consider this the other day, and I was thinking about this question of like, if I were to deconstruct, if I were to walk away from Christianity, how would I engage with Christians? And I've said this on the show many times before, but I thought to myself, I said, look, I would not, I hope I would not, if I was convinced that Christianity is false, I hope I would not go so far to just say, you Christians are just ludicrous and you're crazy and you have no evidence whatsoever. I hope I would still maintain the same position I have today that would say something like, look, I understand the evidence that you have. Here's why I don't think it's convincing. And this is the same thing I approach with atheists. I said, look, I understand the evidence that you have for your views. I understand why you hold your views. And I'm trying to ask questions to understand why they hold their views. And say, I get why you think evolution is true, for example. It's based on X, Y, and Z. And here's how the case that you can make, to where I've had atheists go, wow, that was a really impressive case. I've had atheists really impressed with my atheist role play that I've done places and go, wow, that was really convincing. Because I get the arguments that they at least present. Now, I think there's objections to them and responses to them. I think there's ways to refute them. But to just go, atheists, all myth, all made up, you just have faith, end of story. Atheists would just balk at that and go, that's crazy. What are you talking about? You, Ryan, are not taking this seriously. I think the same is true. I think if we can't respect each other enough to say, hey, I get why you believe it, and I understand what you're pointing to, and then here's why I don't think that's convincing, rather than just dismissing everything as just, you're just ridiculous and you just believe in fairy tales, and belief in the resurrection of Jesus is the same as believing Three Little Pigs got their house blown down. That's crazy. It's just simply not the case. If you just want to look at the mere fact of pigs don't talk, they don't build houses, yet virtually every single historian on the face of the planet believes that Jesus was a real person. So you at least are talking about a real person in a real place, a real death. We have virtually every historian recognizing this Jesus was killed by Roman crucifixion. There are definitely pieces of this story that are true. And it is not in the same category. So again, just saying everything's a myth, everything's a myth, everything's a myth. It's not a conversation. It's not productive. It doesn't engage with the actual evidence. And again, let me just say this. If I went on atheist channels and just commented a myth, what you say is 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 a myth, I'd be laughed out of the room. Everyone knows that. So let's have a better conversation. Sorry if I'm just kind of get on my soapbox here. But I think that there's something different that we're talking about here. Fuzzy comes back and says, if you didn't have eyewitnesses, then how is this any different from other legend? The Christ in Christianity is the hinge of the religion. Well, what you said is eyewitnesses specifically of the resurrection of Jesus. And so if we have eyewitnesses of Jesus' other miracles, if we have eyewitnesses of what Jesus said and taught and believed and did during his earthly life, and then we just miss out on the resurrection, yeah, well, I think that's a huge piece. That is the piece that is different than others. Right? I just addressed this in something else I was writing the other day of what you don't have with other people is an outward visible way to show that they have the proof or have the power to do the things that they're saying they're able to do. Right? So if you look at the person of Jesus and you look at, I forget the passages right off the top of my head, but you look at when John the Baptist sends his disciples to Jesus, says, are you really the one we're waiting for? Should we expect another? Jesus didn't say, yes, just believe. He said, look around you. The dead are raised, the blind see, the lame walk, the deaf hear. Right? Now, if Jesus was actually doing these are visible. He's not just saying, trust me, trust my word. That's what we see with a lot of these other cults and religions today is, trust me, this is what I saw. This is what I experienced. Trust me. Jesus is not saying, just trust me. He's saying, look, I have the power that I'm claiming to have. When they bring the paralytic to Jesus And Jesus says, your sins are forgiven. They wonder in their minds, who are you to have the power to forgive sins? Jesus says, so that you may know that I have the power to forgive sins, stand up and walk. And he allows and heals the paralytic, allows him to stand up right in front of them, giving a physical demonstration of the power of God in him on what he was claiming about the power to forgive sins. He calms the storm. And again, I get that people are going to reject all these miracles, but what I'm trying to claim here is that there's something different about Jesus. It's not, he never just said, well, just simply trust me, close your eyes, have blind faith, and just trust that I can do these things. But he frequently demonstrated his powers and ability. He calms the storm. And the disciples like, oh my goodness, who are you? Surely you are the Lord, you are God. Jesus came, spoke and taught, and then showed that he had power over sickness, power over nature, power over death itself, power that only God has. And so that's, I think, the big thing here is that if we have eyewitnesses to these accounts, if we have testimony that these accounts actually took place, and that shows that there's something unique about the person of Jesus that is not the same as other religions that we have. And I would challenge anyone against this to say, if you say, well, that's the same thing that all religions have, I would challenge you to say, okay, which religion has this sort of documented testimony of eyewitness testimony of miracles that we have with Christianity? And I don't think it's out there. A lot of the miracle accounts attributed to individuals come way after the fact. It's not in the primary sources. And so I don't think that we have something the same. And so I think that even if there were not eyewitnesses of the resurrected Jesus, let's say he rose from the dead and never appeared to anybody, that I think would be hard, that'd be tough, but that wouldn't discredit the fact that we have eyewitness documentation of his earthly miracles prior to his death and his resurrection, which I think would make at least a case for Jesus or something different about the person of Jesus. All right. I'm scanning through the live chat. I don't see any other questions, actually. There's a lot of comments, not as many questions. All right. Here's Fuzzy Jeff commented in again. So again, I don't see anything over Instagram. You Instagram people, where you at? All right. So coming back over here, Fuzzy Jeff writes this again. Fuzzy Jeff, if you want to call in, Travis, if you want to call in, let's chat. You're commenting a ton. As always, appreciate it. But let's chat. If there were no writings for decades after the supposed event and no identifiable contemporary witnesses of the Jesus miracles, would that be sufficient to make you drop Christianity? Okay. If the writings are, let's say, from 300 years after, and there's no contemporary eyewitness documentation or anything, yes. I think that would be deeply problematic if we discredit the New Testament as being any sort of eyewitness and we really know nothing historically about the person of Jesus. That would become deeply problematic. And that would be something that maybe would make me drop Christianity. Now, Fuzzy Jeff, I don't know your view specifically, but I would love to ask you, what could I present? What could be presented that would make you maybe drop your views? If you are an atheist, I don't know. That would make you become a Christian. If Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? And what actually could be presented to help you become a Christian? And you know, it's interesting. I think I shared this maybe last week. I don't remember where I share things. But if I said this before, sorry. But I was actually just talking to an atheist who gave a presentation to a group of Christians on how everything you believe is not actually true, that maybe you believe false things. And then the same atheist was going to give that same presentation on why not everything you believe is probably true to a group of atheists. And it was the atheist group that said, no, I'm not interested, because we are thoughtful, rational individuals and the things that we believe are true. We don't want to hear a presentation, even from a fellow atheist, about how probably there are things that we believe that are not true. And this atheist tells me, isn't it interesting that a group of evangelical Christians have no problem being told that, hey, probably some things that you believe are not true. And they're willing to listen to that and consider it, where a group of atheists were not. That doesn't mean that every group of atheists would not be willing. And that doesn't mean every group of Christians would be willing. But I often get this question of what would cause me to drop my views of Christianity. And I actually have some reasons, some things that would get me to stop believing in Christianity. This is where I think God is falsifiable. And one of the things I forgot to mention in that video on the falsifiability of God is I believe strongly that the Bible teaches a Trinitarian view of God, that God is Trinity, that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is God. And so if Jehovah's Witnesses are right, or Muslims are right, or Jews are right, that God is not Trinity, and I find that the Trinity is either logically problematic or impossible or some fundamental flaw of the Trinity, then I would stop being a Christian. Like, there are things that you could show me to falsify Christian views. I think that there's a lot of stuff in Scripture that is founded on Christianity that you could show that didn't happen, then I would walk away from Christianity. My question often back is, okay, what would be sufficient to make you drop your views and make you switch over to Christianity as well? Now, I would push back on the fact of, depending on how many decades you think it comes after the fact, I think a case can be made, and I've made that case on many shows before, of I think at least the initial early writings. The book of Mark was the first book to be written. I think that you can make a strong case for Mark being written around 40 or 50 AD, about 50. So if Jesus is crucified in 30 AD, you have Mark being written about 20 years after the fact. Many of these individuals would still be alive 20 years after the fact to either say Mark's account is nonsense, is ridiculous, but that didn't happen. The Gospel of Mark spread quickly through the region. We saw Christianity grow very quickly in the early first century, and the very people that were there to have seen and experienced Jesus and whether this things that were being said about him were actually true or not. Again, you have atheists, skeptical historians and scholars saying that the claims and the core of Christianity found in 1 Corinthians 15 of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection and appearances date back to 5 years. Oral traditions going back at least to 5 years to the event itself. And so I don't think that we have these super late, as I mentioned, 200, 300, 400 years after the fact, gospels being written. Nothing can be known from that time. But we have non-Christian historians saying, no, this message was being spread early. And I think the gospels were written early enough to where eyewitnesses were still alive. Paul addresses that in 1 Corinthians 15, where Jesus appeared to 500. Many of them are still alive. Some have died, but they're alive. You can go ask them, so to speak, yourself. And so I think there's something different here. Are any of Jesus' miracles impossible to make up? No, I mean, things can be made up. It's nothing it's impossible to be made up. But the question is, are all of them made up, or can you prove that they are made up? And to simply say, well, miracles don't happen, that's not proof that these didn't happen. You're starting from an assumption that says there are no miracles, therefore these miracles are made up. And that's the assumption that I would push back and challenge. All right, it looks like I just got a call and then it dropped. So I don't know if whoever that was wants to try again. Oh, this is an interesting question. If I believed in evolution, would I stop with Christianity since Genesis would be a lie? Not necessarily. I don't. There are theistic evolutionists or evolutionary creationists. And again, Genesis would not necessarily be a lie, but a specific interpretation of Genesis would be wrong. And again, I've talked about this many times on the show before, is that I think that when we have external evidence, so let's just use a super easy one. Joshua chapter 10 says that the sun stood still. Right? And it says the sun stood still for a time. There we go. There's a call from Jeff. I'll get to you here in a second. And we go, okay, I guess the sun was moving, because that's all they knew at that time, was they look like the sun is moving in the sky. And so they, the sun stood still. When we have scientific evidence then that confirms that it's not the sun that's moving, it's the earth that's moving, and the sun moving through the sky is simply phenomenological language based on observation, but that's not actually what's taking place. We then understand Joshua chapter 10 not as being a lie, but we recognize Joshua is speaking in a way that, based on what he sees, that the sun looks like it's moving. In the same way that we speak today, we talk about sunrise and sunset, not earth rotation. No one walks out and says, oh, what beautiful earth rotation this morning. So when scientific evidence helps us recognize that something that we previously believed was wrong, it doesn't mean that the Bible necessarily was a lie, but it's possible that our interpretation was mistaken. And so there are, while I think evolution is true, there are Christians who believe in evolution and recognize the truth of Genesis as being a more figurative account. Some people classify it as a different type of literature based on how it is written. So there's different ways that you can look at it. And so no, I don't think that evolution being true would automatically mean that Christianity is false, if that makes sense. All right, let me jump over here to my caller. Remove screen room. You hear me? Hello, Jeff.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi. Welcome to the show. Thanks for calling in. And what do you want to chat about?
Yeah. So I was the one asking those questions.
Yeah.
I guess in terms of the resurrection, I just think it is so implausibly like miracles. If we consider it from like a just a prior probability sort of thing, like I would need very strong evidence to overcome sort of the larger body of evidence we have that people don't generally rise from the dead.
Absolutely.
And so I was trying to sort of see what level of evidence like where you're at,
Yeah.
where, if we added one more witness, that would convince you. If we took one witness, that would not convince you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I like the way that you're going with that question. Sorry, I just cut you off.
Mm-hmm. No, go ahead.
Oh, so yeah, I like that. And I think that's a reasonable way to think, because this is not something that we see happening around us every day. And so our common experience says this is not something that should take place or does take place. And so we should hear it and kind of think, yeah, that doesn't seem right. And some people joke about this of like, well, yeah, I mean, if resurrections happened all the time, if this is a naturally occurring thing, then you go talk to, someone and say, hey, Jesus rose from the dead. And they would go, well, so did Uncle Bob last week. And now I got to give the inheritance back. Frank Turek kind of makes that joke. And so this is something that we should go, wait, what? This isn't normal. And so it should lead to pause. And so the question then I think becomes, and my question for you is, number one, I'm curious how my responses to your questions, what you thought about my responses. But even as I said that I would like to ask, but I would be curious at what amount of evidence or what would be needed for you to overcome that hurdle to say, yeah, well, I now can accept that this took place because the evidence for it overwhelms or is convincing enough to go against my experience, the fact that dead people don't come back from the dead.
Right. I think it would definitely need to be more than 4 witnesses who are not very, we don't know a ton about these people. 4 people could easily be wrong about something. 4 people could make something up. I'm not going to default to they made it up, but that is a more likely explanation.
So when you say the 4 people, are you speaking of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or who are you speaking of when you say only 4 people?
You mentioned, I think you were talking earlier about it was Paul, 2 Jameses, and Peter.
Right. So those would be only 4 that we have, I would say, convincing documentation for their martyrdom. The fact that they were martyred for their belief in Jesus' resurrection. We have less convincing documentation of other apostles dying for the faith. But we also would not say that those are the only people that are eyewitnesses, as 1 Corinthians 15, the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15 mentions quite a number of individuals, where he says starting in verse 5 that the risen Jesus appeared to Cephas, then to 12 apostles. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, many of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, to all the apostles. And lastly, he appeared to me. And so we have a long list of individuals that he appeared to here.
Right, but
that again,
I hope you would agree that's one source, not many people.
Well, it's one source mentioning that it was many people. So if I had one source, so for example, let's say that this is, so again, I mentioned, Bart Ehrman, Gerd Luhmann, skeptical, non-Christian historians and scholars will say that this creed was written down about within 5 years of the resurrection account itself, right? So this is not a late legend. Now, let's say, you have even the book of Mark, let's say 20 or so years. Okay. If I come now and say, hey, here's what happened in New York City on September 11, 2001. We're talking about, this is now 2024. So we're talking about a 23-year gap. Now, I'm one source that says, hey, here's how many people died in New York, and here's how many people who witnessed it and who saw it. Anyone who is reading or hearing my one documentation giving these numbers, they could go to New York City and talk to people who were alive 23 years ago and who saw the planes fly into those buildings and saw the buildings fall. And so, yes, you have one documented source, 1 Corinthians 15, but that source is saying, hey, there are 500 people who saw this. You can go talk to them yourself. Now, obviously, we can't go talk to them. So it's like, someone reading my history book that says, hey, this is what happened in New York City, and there's a bunch of living people in New York City right now that can verify what I say. Go talk to them. And then someone finds that letter 1,000 years from now. It's like, okay, that person can't go talk to him. But the question is, when I wrote that letter, let me just make this one point really quickly. The question is, when I wrote that letter, when I made that documentation while the eyewitnesses or supposed eyewitnesses were still alive, did those individuals reject my documentation? Did they reject my letter? Do we have evidence that someone says, no, that history book of what happened on 9/11, that is a bunch of nonsense? Or do we have people recognizing that is what took place and that message spreading because that was the truth?
Well, do you think everyone would have had the capability to actually go and verify 500 people who weren't mentioned by name, or how you could ask them if it happened?
Well, I think, no, not one person, I don't think necessarily is going to walk around and interview all 500 and figure out who they are. But I think the question is this: what do we see happening with Christianity in the early first century when these claims are being made? When the eyewitnesses are there in Jerusalem and the apostles are going around Jerusalem saying, so when the apostles are, so it's documented. Are you talking about? So it's documented historically that Paul and Peter and James and these other individuals were going around Jerusalem. You have Thomas as well, proclaiming that Jesus had been risen from the dead. I mean, this is a pretty historically accepted fact. Bart Ehrman talks about it just being solid historical evidence that, yes, these people were walking around Jerusalem saying that Jesus rose from the dead. The question is, how did the people in Jerusalem, the very city in which Jesus was crucified, how did they respond? Did they say, this is a bunch of nonsense and throw these people out? Or did the people of Jerusalem who were there believe? And we have documentation not only of many of them believing, thousands of them believing, but then Christianity growing so fast that by 70 AD, Nero is seeing Christianity as a threat because it had grown so fast in the region. And so I think that we have something different.
All those people believed because they were presented with the names of the people who they could go ask,
or they were actually there.
It seems pretty easy to, it's pretty easy to spread misinformation. So, it's easy to convince people of things. So I don't know why.
How easy? Okay, how easy is it to spread misinformation and convince someone of something when they were there and experienced it, if it didn't happen?
Wait, sorry. Can you say that again?
How easy is it to convince someone of misinformation and spread false ideas when they were there, knowing that what you're trying to convince them of never took place? So I make a joke about this whenever I speak at summer camps, and I'm in a room full of students, and I say, look, if I called my parents and say, man, in the middle of my lecture, a raccoon ran across the stage, I could convince my parents of that misinformation because they weren't there. But if I try to convince any student who's sitting in that room that
the people in Jerusalem,
if I try to convince them that a raccoon ran across the stage when they were there and knew that it didn't happen, I don't think it's easy to spread that misinformation because they're going to flat out reject it as nonsense because they were there. And so I think to try to convince the people of Jerusalem that Jesus had been crucified and then rose from the dead, I don't think, as you say, it's easy to spread misinformation. I don't think it's easy to spread that misinformation to the people who were there.
Which people?
The people of Jerusalem.
The people of Jerusalem.
And it's also not just this story, right? It's the people living in Jerusalem.
You're saying every person in Jerusalem would have known?
I'm saying if it was false. The historical documentation around the person of Jesus is that he made an impact, that that he was known to be some sort of miracle worker or something, and the fame around him spread and he gathered lots of people. And so we have documentation of him being in this place and people knowing about it. And then at least in the book of Acts, also in the Bible, of course, when Peter preaches his first sermon in Jerusalem, right after the resurrection, it says that 2,000 people believed. Now, again, I think we have other stories that this is confirmed by. For example, in the Gospels, right, it tells the story of Jesus going out to these towns and feeding 5,000 people. Well, we know that the Gospels, when they were written, that they spread throughout the region. They became very widely read. And so there's good reason to believe that people in that town read that documentation that supposedly 20 years earlier, Jesus had shown up and fed 5,000 people with some fish and bread. Now, if that never took place, people would have still been alive when that event supposedly took place. And they could easily said, that's not what happened 20 years ago. And we would have a consensus that what is written in this document is nonsense. Instead, what we have is the Gospels being written and spread, and Christianity growing and spreading because the things that were being said were confirmed by the people who were at these events, and they believed, told these stories, and other people believed.
You're saying people could be confident that, like, the feeding of the 5,000 never happened because they weren't there.
No, I'm saying that when the Gospel of Mark, for example, that tells the story of the feeding of the 5,000, when it showed up, when it spread, as it was being copied and passed along and spread, when it spread to the city in which this event supposedly took place about 20 or 30 years later, the people would have still been alive that were there 20 years earlier at that event. And if what Mark wrote took place, didn't take place, then we should have that town or those people rejecting that document as false. Just again, like if a history book came out that said airplanes never flew into buildings in New York City, we would unanimously reject that history book. But if a history book is written now 20 years later saying, here's what happened on September 11, 2001 in New York City, and that history book is widely accepted by the American people, then 1,000 years from now, I think you can build a strong case that, like, look, this book that claims this is what happened, and this book was widely accepted by the people who were alive at that time and would have known if that took place, there's good reason to believe that event actually took place. Versus if the book I'm reading tells a story of what happened in New York and all the people in New York rejected this book as being true history, then I think that there's then good reason to reject that book. Does that make sense?
Okay, well, I'm trying to understand the logic here. So somebody from that town would have been so, like, assuming it didn't happen, if it didn't happen, somebody from that town would have been so confident that they were there and they would have known about it, that they would have spread to everyone that this was misinformation?
Well, I'm saying that when a document shows up claiming something took place in your city, and if that thing never took place in your city, then the people of that city would have rejected it, right? Like, just like I said, if I made up a story that New York...
And they would have rejected it and told everyone else that they should reject it as well? Or would they have just rejected it and gone about their day and other people accepted it?
I think that document would have been rejected. And then you maybe would have seen maybe that document accepted other places. But if you know that the document is telling a story about a place, and if you know that people in that place don't accept that document, then I think that's good reason to doubt what is being said. So again, if we want to make this more modern, if I wrote a book about New York City and I said that the Twin Towers were never attacked, maybe I could get some people in, like, I don't know, like New Zealand or something. I don't know. So obviously now with our news and how much everything spreads, you couldn't do this. But let's say there's no internet, no phones, no nothing. There's no communication. Maybe I could convince some people in another part of the world that never took place, and they might believe me. But if you know that the people of New York City reject what I'm saying, then I think that's good reason to believe that what I'm saying is not true. It doesn't matter who else accepts it. If the people who supposedly were there when it took place reject it, I think that's good reason to reject it. If the people who were supposedly there when it took place accept it, I think that's good reason to accept it, right?
Okay, so you're saying there were enough people from that town who would have been confidently espousing the falsity of this claim, that they would have prevented the spread that we see.
So the argument I'm making is that when the Gospels are written and began to circulate, they circulated very quickly, and we don't have evidence of these cities in which supposed events took place rejecting these documentations. Instead, New Testament documentation spread quickly,
first of all,
it was accepted, and Christianity grew rapidly.
The Gospels weren't really widespread. I mean, they weren't even written, I don't think, until 70, 80, more, or maybe if we're generous, we can say 50, but I think that's being way too generous. But like,
what evidence do you have for 70?
My awareness is that is what a good number of scholars believe. I think.
So what would be their reasons for believing that, though?
Gosh, you're rocking my brain. I think there is stuff about like the fall of the temple and maybe like the Q source, but I'm not confident on it. So I'll grant you it was written in the 50s. Sure, let's say 20 years after the event.
Okay.
But wouldn't it have spread before then?
For sure. I mean, it spread orally. It obviously didn't spread physically in writing because it wasn't written until 20 years later. But we have oral traditions that spread quicker. And then that's why I think that because orally we have documentation in the book of Acts and others, we have scholars like Josephus and others talking about how Christianity spread orally very quickly. That's why I think that then when these Gospels are written, let's say 20 years later, the book of Mark, and the Gospel of Mark is written and then also spread and accepted, then I think that's evidence that what he was writing was true, or at least that's a case. Just like, again, if I wrote something about New York City and the people of New York City accept what I write as true, then a case can be made. I think that maybe what he's saying is true.
So now you're going based on how fast the gospel spread, not how fast Christianity spread?
No, not necessarily. I'm saying Christianity spread quickly. The Gospels, when they were written, were accepted quickly, and they spread. It's just, how do we account for Sorry, you just broke up.
You said that it spread orally first, right? So
so it was being spread 20 years before the Gospels were written. No, I'm not saying that the Gospels were pivotal in causing Christianity to spread. But I'm saying that when the Gospels were written and when they began to spread, they were accepted by the early Christians as being true. And so if the people who were at these events accepted what was written as true, why would we say it wasn't? Again, it's like a society, it's a history book about, like, it does it. Let me just ask this question really quickly. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Would it, if a history book right now is written about New York City and the New Yorkers accept that history book as true, and that, okay, they accept it. And then a society 2,000 years from now says, no, I don't think that a case is true. Like, would that not like make you go, what? Like, what? But the people who were there when it was written and when it happened, they all believed it was true. Why are you saying it's not? Does that not seem a little bit off?
Well, I don't think that's perfectly analogous, because how many of the claims of the gospel specifically identify a location?
I mean, many of them. We have the Pool of Bethsaida. Bethsaida has been found as a real place. We have the Pool of Siloam. The Pool of Siloam has been found as a real place. We have documentation of claiming of things happened in Jerusalem. We have, even in the Old Testament, we have the fall of Jericho. We have done archaeological discoveries and we found Jericho. And there's even a burn layer of Jericho that matches consistency with the fact that the Israelites conquered it and burned the city. We have the feeding the 5,000. And Bethsaida has been discovered. Jerusalem. I mean, these cities are real, and we've done archaeological discoveries, and we found coins and burial masks, and we have the Tel Dan stele that documents that King David was a real historical person. We have the bone box of Caiaphas, the high priest. And that matches up with the biblical account. We have the fact that Pontius Pilate was a real person, and he really was. And he's mentioned in the Bible as being the prefect over Judah at that time when the Bible describes it. We have the Pontius Pilate inscription saying that he was the prefect of Judah during the time when the Bible says that Pontius Pilate was the prefect over Judah. And so, I mean, we have a lot of archaeological discoveries confirming people, names, dates, and locations of this. In fact, there are, if I can pull up really quickly, I forget the number off the top of my head, but I think that there were about nearly 100 historically confirmed details in the book of Acts, in the Gospels. The New Testament cites more than 30 people that have been confirmed by secular sources in archaeology. And Luke, in the book of Luke, names 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands without committing an error. So, I mean, we're placing this at a real historical time that we can then go back, and people have made predictions. Archaeologists have made predictions of, if the biblical account is true, we should expect to find something in this spot. They dig there, and then they find that thing that they're expecting to find. And so just like in science, if we say, hey, based on the scientific evidence, I should find X here, and I go look and I find that, then that's confirmation. That's the predictability. And people have used biblical documentation to predict discoveries in archaeology that then have been confirmed.
Okay, but I think you've kind of switched it up there. We were talking about claims that people would be able to be confident, so confident that it didn't happen that they would have rejected the Gospels. And so, like, a lot of the stuff you said is like if I'm a person living in that time when the Gospels are starting to be spread around, and I'm from one of those locations, and I see that someone is claiming that this miracle took place 20, 30 years ago at a place where I'm from, well, then I'm going to be like, well, I didn't see that happen. I didn't hear about that. But for one thing, you don't hear everything that ever happens. For another, a real person named Jesus might have visited that place. And so, like, there would have been talk about him and buzz about this supposed miracle worker. So maybe it would even seem plausible, even if you weren't there to see it happen.
Right. So I'm not saying that every single person saw and heard every single detail. Just like not every single person saw George Washington do what he did, or not, whatever. But if the right people saw it, documented it, and others right were there to confirm the documentation. I mean, just right people in the sense that the people who were there. So if certain individuals were there, saw it, documented it, and others who were also there confirmed that documentation as being true, then while Bob standing on the other side of the city may never have seen anything, that's not a reason to say this event never took place.
So you're saying you're confident that people were affirming these stories based on the fact that they weren't rejected.
So what I'm saying is, if this is all made up, if it's not true, all the miracle accounts, the gospel writings, the claims of Jesus' death and resurrection, if it's all a lie, how do you explain the spread of Christianity in the early first century in the very location where all of these things supposedly happened but never did? How would you explain the spread of Christianity?
Do you not think legends can happen?
Legends happen after time, but we're talking about Christianity spreading instantly.
You don't think there are legends from the last 20 years?
What legend?
New
like
legends.
What example would you be talking about?
I don't have a specific one off the top of my head, but
yeah, I think if someone's going to try to create a legend about New York, I don't know if this is a bad example. It just keeps coming to mind. New York City. And all of a sudden someone comes along and says, no, it wasn't 2 planes. It was 500 planes, and they flew into 70 different buildings and they destroyed half the city. I mean, that legend is never going to pass because people are still alive that would say that's a bunch of nonsense. The only way you're going to get a legend like that to pass about New York City is if you go to some other country that is completely disconnected from the world and tell them it took place, and maybe you can get them to believe. But this goes back to a previous point, is I don't think you're going to get the people to believe who were there, who would have seen it. In order for a legend to happen is you have to be telling people that were never there.
I think you're too confident in the reliability of people.
Are people always mistaken?
They're not always mistaken, no.
Can we tell the truth?
Yes.
Okay, so then we have to give reasons why these people were not telling the truth. You can't just say, well, they could be mistaken. Of course they could be mistaken, but they could also be true.
Well, they could.
So if you're going to tell me that they're mistaken, I need an actual argument that they're mistaken rather than just saying, I'm being too confident that they weren't.
Well,
because I'm giving reasons confirmed by historical data as to why I think what they were saying is true. And I haven't heard an objection against the reasons I'm saying specifically. It's just, well, maybe they're wrong. Well, of course, maybe they're wrong.
Holding up a proposition that I hope you would agree that at its face, it's quite a implausible proposition that you're presenting, right?
A resurrection from the dead, yes. As in, we don't experience that every time.
Don't you think that you would need a strong amount of evidence?
I think that we would need sufficient evidence.
Such thing?
Sufficient evidence.
Okay. What do you mean sufficient? Because
enough evidence to make a case. So, for example,
I mean, it's not the same sort of case evidence you would need for a murder trial. It's something like much beyond that.
Why is that?
Because murders happen.
Right.
Evidentially.
Right.
So if these are not the same types of propositions.
So people live and murders and people die. And so that's why I think in one sense it's simple. If you can give evidence that Jesus was alive at point A, dead at point B, and alive at C, you have evidence for a miracle. I mean, that's pretty simple. And so...
Sure, evidence, but sufficient evidence, not necessarily.
So what would be sufficient for you then? So this goes back to your initial question. And Mirza, I see that you're there. We had like an hour-long conversation last week, and so I want to try to get to you, but I want to kind of finish this conversation with Jeff, so I apologize, Mirza.
Sure.
But what would be sufficient evidence to you that would convince you that Jesus did rise from the dead?
Okay, well, let's think about modern times just as a starting point. If we like one way we could show that a person rose from the dead in modern times is that we could have a person predict that they're going to this is just a sufficient condition. I'm not saying it's a necessary condition. If we had a prediction that a person is going to rise from the dead, and so we camp up, set up cameras at their deathbed, and then they pass away, and then we medically confirm that they are dead, and then we keep the cameras rolling and keep the controls, and then some days later they rise again. That would be sufficient condition. Now, that obviously is an extreme amount of evidence. Is there some lesser amount of evidence that would convince me? Probably, but it would need to be not too much worse than that, I don't think, to convince me.
Okay. So I'm just curious. 2 quick questions. Number one is, do you think what you just presented there would convince everyone? Or do you think some people would still say, I think the film is doctored? Because clearly we can doctor, film all the time. We've seen a million movies of people die and come back from the dead. So I just think these are doctored. Like, or do you
Sure.
think people could still
There are
reject
some
the
people
evidence
who
that you
would
have?
reject even that.
Okay. Now, secondly, I think the other point though is the fact of what you provided as evidence that would convince you is obviously impossible to have for Jesus.
Obviously impossible. What do you mean?
Well, we don't have the ability to set up cameras and hook Jesus up to, a heart monitor and EKG machines to test his brain before and after he died and rose from the dead. So we can't apply what you just gave that would convince you of a modern day resurrection. We can't apply that to Jesus. And so what would convince you of Jesus? If that's the sort of evidence you need, are you saying nothing would convince you of Jesus 2,000 years ago because we can't have that? Or is there something that I could provide, that someone could provide that says, I actually think Jesus did rise from the dead?
I'm not sure that okay, let's imagine that we had 1,000 people back then who we have their identities and details about exactly who they were, and they all said that they witnessed Jesus go up onto a cross and get punctured by a spear and get taken into a tomb, and then have him rise up and be walking around for 40 days. If we had 1,000 such people, I would be pretty impressed by that. Would that be sufficient to overcome the prior probability of people not rising from the dead? Maybe. I don't know. I just think rising from the dead is very, very implausible. So I'm not sure that even if I don't think that even if you made your case that that like we had these accounts very near after the resurrection supposedly happened, I'm not sure that even that would convince me.
So what then are you trying to accomplish in discussing evidence if no amount of evidence would convince you?
I'm asking from your perspective.
Yeah.
Like, why do you believe? Because I think you should reject it just on the absurdity of somebody rising from the dead, and the amount of evidence we have is nowhere close to the amount of evidence that would be sufficient.
So would you agree with me that it is only absurd for people to rise from the dead if God does not exist?
True.
Yeah. Okay. So here's where I think in this conversation often comes back to worldview and presuppositions, is that you seem to be presupposing, and I don't know all your views, but you seem to be presupposing that there is no God, miracles are impossible, therefore resurrections are absurd. And I'm presupposing that there is a God, miracles are possible, and therefore the resurrection is not absurd if there's enough evidence to support it. This then comes back to a deeper question of, is there a God or not? And is there reason to believe that there is some sort of supernatural God who could, in theory, rise someone from the dead? And so this is a conversation that's often guided by our presuppositions before we ever even look at the evidence. So you seem to be ruling out miracles as a possibility before ever looking at the evidence for the resurrection. And so you're never going to conclude that a miracle took place because miracles are not possible.
I feel like this is, as you're presenting it, is sort of like if somebody won 3 lotteries in a row and you question them on the statistical near impossibility of that, and they said, well, I'm just lucky, and if I'm lucky, then it makes sense that I would win 3 lotteries in a row.
So it's very improbable for someone to do that. The question is, if they can produce for you 3 winning lottery tickets, then all they need are 3 simple pieces of paper, and that's sufficient evidence to convince you that they won 3 lotteries in a row.
The alternative is that they cheated, that somebody from the lottery system helped them. Like, there's other explanations for that.
Okay, so then you have to show evidence that there is actually foul play at work, that there's somehow in which you're doctoring the evidence.
I would say that the improbability, like the probability of that happening is lower than most scientific standards. Like the p-value, if we're talking in math terms, like it's so absurdly small, right. Like it wouldn't happen by random chance.
Yeah. And so that's why I just think that the prior beliefs that we have on the existence and the nature of God changes everything. Because if God does exist,
I agree.
If Jesus is God, then the probability of this taking place is not impossibly low, like your example of the lottery. And in fact, this is what we, in a sense, should expect, because Jesus predicted his own death and his resurrection while he was still alive. And so if God does exist, if this God created the entire universe out of nothing, then rising a dead person back from the dead and bringing him back to life, I mean, that's easy.
But the lottery winner could just say, well, if you already believe a priori that I am lucky, then it makes sense, and so you shouldn't challenge the legitimacy.
Yeah, I don't think that's an equivalent analogous to just saying I'm lucky and therefore believe it.
Why not?
We're saying because we're talking about a God who actually has the ability. So if you recognize I have the ability to do X, it's not just about luck at that point. It's that he has the ability to do it. He can just do it.
By definition, has the ability to win 3 lotteries.
Well, but we're not talking about luck. So if I said, look, I have the ability to raise my hand. I mean, maybe this is just stupid, but I have the ability to raise my hand in the air because that's an ability I have. You would not say, wow, Ryan, you're so lucky. It's like, well, no, there's no luck involved. I can just do it because there's no luck necessary here. And so if God has the ability to raise people from the dead because that's an ability he has, there's no luck involved there. It's just he can do it if he wants to. Just like I can raise my hand if I want to. You would not say there's luck involved.
I'm talking about probabilities. So the probability of winning the lottery is very small. The probability of winning it 3 times in a row is extremely, extremely small. And so the prior probability of doing that is implausibly small. And I'm drawing that analogy to the prior probability of raising from the dead.
Right.
And in both cases, like you're saying, well, if the proposition is true, then it's probable that this happened. And I'm saying, well, if the proposition that this guy is lucky is true, then it's probable that he would have won. Yeah. So does that mean we should just believe it?
Okay, so here's where I think I think this is so good, and this is fascinating. I'm really loving this, Jeff. Thank you for calling in. Here's where I think there's a difference. With the lottery, we're talking about chance, not just also luck, but we're talking about randomness. With the action of God raising Jesus from the dead, we're not talking about randomness. So, for example, let me just work this out. So,
pseudo-deterministic.
Well, I mean, but the lottery is random in the sense of what numbers are come up. Versus when we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus, we're talking about an act by an individual person to choose to do something. So for example, it's like, well, what's the probability that my son gets a bicycle for Christmas? And you could figure out what the probability is for that. And you're like, what about if he gets a bicycle for 2 Christmases in a row? What about 3 Christmases in a row? And it's like, well, look, if that's what he's asking for, and that's what me as a father wants to give him, we would there's no randomness involved because that is what I am choosing to do for my son. And therefore doing something 3 times in a row does not add to its unlikeliness because it's just a choice that someone is making to do. And they have the ability to choose to do that or not. That's very different than flipping a coin and seeing what takes place or rolling dice of that nature. So it's like, hey kid, I'm going to give you a bicycle. If I roll these dice and it rolls a 5, and then all of a sudden you got 5 bicycles in a row because I rolled 5 5s in a row, like that becomes unlikely or improbable because we're talking about dice rolls that has a randomness to it. But if I just chose to buy my son 5 bicycles, there's no randomness there, and therefore it doesn't become more unlikely in that scenario. Does that make sense? Because we're talking about an individual person's choice and their ability to do it, and they have the ability to do it. Therefore, I don't see it analogous to winning the lottery that has the randomness of the numbers and the luck of the person because they don't actually have the power to influence those choices.
Well, their luck does. Like, I'm talking about, they're making the case that they have a literal like luck aura. Like, if they're claiming that they have the capacity to just win lottery.
Yeah, but I get what you're saying. I just don't think it's analogous. We're talking about randomness, and luck is not the same as someone making a choice. My son might say, well, I got so lucky, I got a new bicycle, but there was no luck involved. I bought him a bicycle because that's what he asked for.
Well, I mean, I just said
but
that
luck is involved in the lottery because it's randomness. So
well, if the person
I'm 5 minutes over. Sorry, Jeff.
Sure.
So I'm
Okay,
5 minutes over my time, and Mears
Yeah.
has been waiting a long time. So I want to address something. But let me just offer one thought though to you really quickly, because you said if there were 1,000 people that saw this, then maybe I'd believe. If you read in Acts chapter 2, starting in verse 36, Peter makes the claim. He says, let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. So Peter is speaking to the people of Jerusalem and saying, you were the ones who crucified Jesus. And it says, when the people heard this, they were cut to the heart and said to Peter and the rest of the brothers, what shall we do? Peter said, repent and believe. And then in verse 41, it says that 3,000 souls believed that day. And so here are 3,000 people that Peter's claiming you were the ones that crucified Jesus. And then those 3,000 people believed Peter and said, you know what? You're right, Peter. I'm going to repent and believe in you. And so here I think we have another case you can make and say, it's not just 1,000 like you were claiming that claimed to have seen or crucified Jesus and seen him risen, but you have 3,000 people that Peter says you crucified Jesus. And then those 3,000 people turn around and believe. And so we're not just talking about one or two off people. We're talking about a very large group of individuals that are believing, and then that is where the ball starts rolling and Christianity starts spreading. And so my pushback would be, if this things didn't actually take place, how would you convince 3,000 individuals that this is what took place? And this is what happened, and allow for Christianity to spread. And if you go, well, everything written in the book of Acts is just made up, it's a late legend. Well, it's not late legend because it was written while the eyewitnesses would have still been able to be alive. And then that gets back to our conversation about the dating of the Gospels and accepting of the document. So anyways, let me give you the last word, and then I'm going to jump really quickly over to Mirza, see what he has to say before I end the show.
Just to the last thing you said, I would say that is one source, not 3,000 independent sources. And so that has a drastic effect on the probability. Okay. But thank you for the conversation.
Absolutely. Jeff, thank you so much. Love to chat with you again. Have a good rest of your day.
All right. Bye.
Bye. All right, sorry it's so long, but hey, I talked to you for an hour last week, and so I think I was.
I know, right? You gotta go faster through your guests. I mean, we take your time and monopolize. Thank you for listening to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can give you a few minutes. What's on your mind?
So do you believe in UFO adoption? Kidnappings, what they call them? UFO kidnappings, ghosts, Bigfoot. You know, all these things that have witnesses and evidence. And in fact, are you a Catholic? You're not a Catholic, right?
I'm not a Catholic, no.
So there are Catholic miracles. There are kids who saw Virgin Mary, and church tried to get them to recant, and they stuck to their story. They gave same description, you know, and they even healed people from cancer, right? These are people you can talk to right now, you know, written right now. And that's not going to make you a Catholic, I don't think. You're not going to now go searching for it and switch your religion, are you?
I mean, I've looked into some of these accounts, and I've looked into some of the claims, not every single claim, and at least the ones I've looked into, I did not find convincing. And so I completely understand the atheist who listens to
really
me and says,
a woman. Why not find them convincing? Because these are people who can talk to right now, as opposed to a story written in Greek about people who spoke a different language. You know, I mean, this is more nearer to your time. These are people who are alive now. This is documented not in one or two places, but everywhere. Why wouldn't you believe it?
So I don't know exactly which ones you're referring to, and if you have some that you can shoot my way.
So there's, like, for example, Medjugorje.
So I don't remember exactly the names of them, and I do have to apologize, and I do have to run soon. Sorry I didn't get to you sooner. But let me just say
look
this:
him up.
if
Your soul is online, so you should be Catholic.
Yeah. So comment in the section below with some links to some of the things you've talked about. But at least the ones that I've looked into, a lot of them are like in the far distant. I saw something, and it's not. It did not have the same sort of closeness of Jesus coming, of saying, here, touch my hands, my side, see me. He didn't like eating and drinking. It's different. Or you have something like, with, Joseph Smith, it's saying, well, people saw the golden plates. And then you read in the Doctrines of Covenants, it says, well, they saw them in faith. And it's like, okay, they didn't see them physically. Like, so right. I think there's ways in which you recognize people can collude and people can lie and people can make stuff up. And that can happen. And so I'm completely sympathetic to the atheist who says, Ryan, what you're claiming here is not convincing. And I get that because people can lie and make things up. I do think, though, when I evaluate the claims of other miracle stories, and maybe I'm being biased, but I haven't seen a persuasive case for why these sort of miracles have as much explanatory power and have as much testability and credibility as what we see with the gospel account. And I think especially with what I was talking about with Jeff, in the fact of people who were there, who experienced and saw these things, believing in Christianity spreading like wildfire, which were among the very people who could have disproven it.
No. First, the reason Christianity spreads fast is the same reason that Mormonism spreads fast, which is very aggressive, in-your-face sales force. Like, Muslims are not going to knock on your door or send people in the jungle to convert people, right? The whole point of Christianity is evangelism, and that's why it's spreading, not because it's true, but because there's somebody selling you on the idea. But second, you don't have eyewitnesses. You have a story. All you have is a story. I mean, did you really imagine that the apostles were tortured and there was a stenographer there recording everything, and they said, if you don't recount, we'll kill you, and if you do, we'll let you go and give you a gift basket? That's absurd. I mean, it's ridiculous on its face, right? It's like, who would present them with that choice? Like, it doesn't matter what they say, they will kill him anyways. It's not like people witnessing the interrogation or whatever. Anyways, you get my meaning.
Of course,
it's a story, basically. All it is a story.
Well, everything's a story until it's
but
written.
This is all one story. Like, there's no.
False?
I'm sorry.
The question is the story true or false? Not just whether it's a story. Of course, it's a story that was
right,
written.
and there is nothing. Right, there's nothing about Gospels. There's nothing outside of Gospels. There's no reports of Jesus outside at the time that he lived in. Like, it would be as if somebody wrote about lunar landing 60 years after it happened in French. That's...
So we have Roman historians, Tacitus. We have Jewish historians, Josephus.
That was decades after. And all they do is report.
Sure.
All they do is report what Christians believe in. They believe in the Jesus. In fact, Tacitus calls him Christ, which is Greek name. Not. It doesn't say Jesus of Nazareth. It says Christ, which is the Greek title meaning whatever.
Sure. Now, one of the things that
right. So there's nothing at the time of Jesus.
One other thing on your comment about Mormonisms is, I just Googled this really quickly. There's about 2.4 billion Christians in the world. There's only about 17 million Mormons. And so clearly,
yeah, but
Mormonism
you had 2,000 years. They had 100 years.
Well, sure. But you have Christianity being very, very large in the face of persecution around that same time. And so, I mean, that doesn't mean that it's true for sure. But again, the question is what allowed for this spread, and could the
very
and who
aggressive
was
sales. Very aggressive sales. Like they're evangelicals. They dream to go into the jungle and convert natives. People will give you flyers. You don't see that from Hindus. You don't see that from Buddhists. It's the sales in Christianity and Mormonism are super aggressive, and that's why Mormonism is one of the fastest growing religion, as well as Jehovah's Witnesses. It's not because of truth. It's because of sales. I mean. But the point is, anyways, I think I said everything. I'm not going to keep you. I know you have a family to go to.
I appreciate it. And I just think, look, and Mormons will try to make this claim about persecution and things like that. But I think that when you look at the first century Christianity, sure, Christians are evangelistic and they're trying to persuade. And that's absolutely the case. But when you're looking at what the Romans did against the Christians and the, the Colosseum and burning at the stake and all the things that took place in the early first century, you had every reason not to be a Christian. And I think there's something different about the evangelism and sales pitches of today's religions than what we saw in the first century. So I would find a hard case to be made to say that first century people are being sold on a bunch of lies and then facing the persecution of the Roman people during that time. And so,
I don't think Christians were that persecuted as opposed to any other group. And, I mean, they're still around, for one, as were Jews, and no European religion. There are no more pagans. There are no more Druids. There are no more Wiccans. Christians kind of destroyed them all. So I don't think they were that persecuted. Those were barbaric times, and people were, killed brutally. And I don't think it's. At one point, was it Emperor Nero blamed Christians for a fire that he set? But it's not like. We have
documentation of Christians being burned at the stake and thrown in the Colosseum. I mean, there's a lot of first century persecution that took place.
Right, but that's the other thing. That's par for the course. Everybody was burned at the stake. In fact, Jesus was killed with two other guys. You think that Jesus was this significant figure, and he was killed, and everybody will remember him. No, he was like one of many preachers. He was killed in an execution that was probably normal for Friday afternoon. Like, people did not remember that month for afterwards, There were no guards at the tomb. There were no special. He was just a dude who caused a riot in the market, and Romans killed him with two thieves. There's no. Anyways,
I guess what I'm just trying to say is, I'm not claiming Jesus is the only one that was ever killed or crucified. Clearly, that was taking place, but I think it's a pretty universally known historical fact that there was an extra level of persecution against first century Christians, and you have Roman and Jewish historians writing about this sort of thing. So anyways, maybe there's a debate there to be had. But hey, Mirza, appreciate the call. It was really good to chat with you last week into this week, and have a good rest of your day.
You too. Bye.
All right, everybody. Well, I got to run. Videos are going to pop up on the side over here, helping you think about a lot of different issues. In fact, I'm going to include the video by Dr. Clay Jones on his book, wherever I just put it, Immortal. That might be an interesting conversation to talk about how the fear of death actually drives us. Other videos are going to pop up. And again, next Tuesday, I'm going to be gone. I'm heading to West Virginia on Thursday, but I will be back for just a live Q&A on Thursday of next week. And I will work through callers faster. So if I see someone waiting, I'm going to get through them faster and hopefully get through a lot of more callers and questions of yours. But hey, I really appreciate this. Thank you for being here. Continue to think deeply about these things because they are worth thinking about. See you next time, everybody. Have a good rest of your week. Bye.